Title of this panel, Beyond Carrots and Sticks, Encouraging a Speak-Up Culture. We could have called it internal reporting or whistleblowing. I think there's a lot of different terms that people use referring to this concept, but we chose speak-up culture because I think it well encapsulates the challenge relating to behavior and psychology within organizations with respect to this very important both ethics and compliance issue. As you'll see from some of the research, internal reporting ends up being one of the most powerful tools companies have in order to understand what's really going on within their company with respect to ethics and fraud in particular. So how do we encourage speak-up cultures within organizations? So we're really thrilled to have some experts speaking with us today on this topic. So we'll start first with Elizabeth Morrison, who's a professor in creative management here at Stern. She's also the Vice Dean of Faculty at the Business School. And then Sean Martin, the Assistant Professor of Management and Organizations at the Carroll School of Management in Boston College. They're two of the leading experts relating to research on employee voice and speak-up cultures in organizations. So we'll begin the session with their remarks on the research, and then we'll transition to Rick Wolf, who is a Senior Vice President and Chief Ethics Officer at HSBC North America, and he's going to present his perspective as an ethics officer within an organization as it relates to managing ethics on a day-to-day basis. So I'm keeping biographical notes short. The full bios are in the program brochure. And we'll get started with Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Azish said, we've been asked to speak about how to create cultures in organizations that encourage speaking up. And to do this, we really need to understand something about the psychology of employees speaking up, what's been termed employee voice, and the psychology of failure to speak up or employee silence. So that's where I'm going to start. There's actually been an explosion of research in recent years on this phenomenon of employee voice. And what employee voice refers to is any informal and discretionary communication with suggestions, concerns, information about problems, opinions about work-related issues to somebody who might be in a position to take action. So this is broader than just speaking up about ethical issues, but it certainly includes speaking up about ethical concerns. Part of what's driving this interest in understanding voice and the conditions that predict voice is the recognition that voice is critically important for organizational functioning, and important in a variety of different ways. We know from a large body of research on group decision making that groups make better decisions when different points of views are expressed, particularly minority viewpoints, viewpoints that are not held by the majority. Research on organizational learning has highlighted the value and the necessity of critical and timely and in particular negative feedback that can be used for error correction as an essential ingredient for organizational learning and improvement and adaptability. And perhaps most relevant for our conversation today around ethics, voice is essential for avoiding and curtailing major problems. In fact, lack of voice and cultures of silence have been implicated in a number of very well-known corporate scandals, Enron, WorldCom, catastrophic errors and accidents like the BP oil spill, the Challenger space shuttle explosion, and others. So voice is important in a variety of different ways, and particularly for preventing serious problems from escalating. Some of you may be familiar with the Department of Homeland Security "If you see something, say something" campaign, and if you're in New York, you've perhaps seen signs like this in the subway. This is a really nice, simple concept, isn't it? If you see something, say something, right? Well, it's not so simple, and certainly in workplaces it's not so simple. We know that employees see things all the time, but they don't necessarily speak up about it. And the evidence is pretty strongly consistent with that. One study found that 70% of employees who were surveyed felt afraid to speak up about certain issues. In a study that I did more recently with some of my colleagues here at NYU, we found that 85% of the people that we interviewed felt they could not speak up about one or more issues of concern, and when we asked them about these issues, in many cases these were ethical issues. In healthcare, where speaking up and failure to speak up is a significant problem around errors and so forth, one study found that fewer than 10% of healthcare professionals, including doctors and nurses, confront their colleagues when they become aware of poor clinical judgment. And we know from the whistleblowing literature that estimates of only about half of employees who observe wrongdoing report it. There's also some research suggesting that this withholding, this reluctance, this silence is particularly pronounced by among employees who feel that they are lower in status and don't have a lot of power in their organization. So what do we do about this? Well, before we can answer that question, we need to understand something about the psychology of silence. And what we've come to appreciate is that there's two main, at a psychological level, two main things that seem to be at the root of an employee's decision to not speak up when they have issues and concerns or witness wrongdoing. The first is a feeling of futility, and the second is fear. Employees essentially need to feel that speaking up is psychologically safe, and psychological safety is found to be a really important component of a culture that people feel comfortable and willing to speak up, and that it's worth the effort. The reality, though, is that employees often don't feel these things. What we hear again and again when we talk to employees about situations where they have not spoken up about things, we hear, why bother? It's not worth the effort. Nobody really wants to hear it. Nothing will happen. A sense of futility is captured by this cartoon. Even when managers may say, oh, I have an open door policy, come to me, what employees are often picking up from the subtle cues is nobody really wants to hear it and nothing's going to happen. Fear, and this is so common that it's even been termed the deaf ear syndrome, and we've come to recognize that even for the managers with the best of intentions, it is really hard to be open and responsive to negative information. Managers are human beings, and human beings find negative information about problems threatening. There's a natural defensiveness. Managers are often operating in an environment where they're being bombarded with information about problems. And when one more problem comes to your door, it's just the last thing you really want to hear. And employees pick up on these cues and nobody really wants to hear it. And we've come to discover that managers have a variety of beliefs about their own competence, their own expertise, the competence and expertise of their employees that also can lead them to send off signals that any concerns that are raised are likely to be falling on deaf ears. Fear is also a big part of silence, failure to voice. This is another cartoon that I really like from the New Yorker. Humorous, but humorous in the way that it is just so close to the truth. And it's not so humorous if you realize that this is the reality of that many people experience in the workplace. In some of the interviews that my colleagues and I have done, asking people about their fears of speaking up, we hear a whole host of different fears that people have. Fears of retaliation and career consequences. Something bad will happen, they won't get a promotion, they may even get fired. Fear of damaging relationships, of people that they depend on to get their jobs done. Fear of inflicting harm on somebody else, getting somebody else in trouble. As social beings, we were often fearful of that. And fear of harming how you are seen by others, being labeled negatively. We heard things like, I don't want to be seen as a troublemaker, a tattletale. I want to be a team player. I mean, all of these fears of looking bad if you raise certain issues that are seen as risky. Here's two quotes that capture some of this fear, which I think are kind of nice illustrations. The first is from Shirley Watkins, who was the woman who eventually blew the whistle at Enron, but prior to that, she had been trying to get awareness of what was going on internally, and she said, to raise these issues, she felt would have been a job-terminating move. The second quote is from one of the people that I interviewed in one of my studies, and this is a female chemist, and she said managers would take mental notes. They'd hold it against you. You had to watch what you said. if you did an okay job and never said anything controversial, you would move up. Are these fears justified? And that's, I think, a worthwhile question to ask, because, or is it just that people have these ideas in their head, or is there a reality to them? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that they may be justified in some cases. One study found that people who speak up about moral issues can be seen as less warm and friendly than those who comply and don't speak up. Another study found that managers don't like and rate more negatively employees who speak up about problems, consistent with a don't want to hear it mentality. And there's some evidence from a very recent study that these negative views of people who speak up may be even more severe for women than men. On the other hand, there's what appears to be an interesting disconnect between the beliefs that people have and the reality of their workplace. In one very interesting study, people who talked about, well, if you speak up, something bad will happen, you'll get fired, you won't get a promotion. And then the interviewer said, well, can you tell me about a time where something bad has happened when somebody spoke up? And these quotes are illustrative. People basically said, well, no, nobody ever gets fired here. And so, but this is an important, this is an important point. People have these beliefs, but they can't necessarily justify because of what they experience. But that doesn't make those fears any less real. What it suggests is that these beliefs and these fears about the dangers of speaking up and the futility of speaking up are partly a function of things in the work environment and things that organizations can do to intervene and to try to create cultures that will encourage speaking up. But they're also rooted in implicit theories and mental structures in the mind that are a lot harder to change and that need to be appreciated as we think about how to design cultures that will encourage more speaking up. By implicit theories, what we mean, and this is work by a variety of people, including some work that Linda has done, is referring to deeply seated beliefs about authority, about dissent, that have little to do with the reality of the current situation. One example of an implicit belief that people have about voice is, well, it's dangerous to challenge a supervisor. Just kind of as a general belief. These beliefs seem to be partly hardwired. We've evolved through millions of years of living in human societies that are hierarchically arranged to be somewhat vigilant and self-protective in the face of higher status others. They're also partly learned prior to our entry into the workplace. From a very early age, think about how some of the things that children are taught. Don't speak back. Don't challenge authority. Don't be a tattletale. Right? So even when people enter the workplace, they have these things in their heads that this is just not behavior that is safe or welcome to do. And like most deep-seated beliefs, they're hard to change. And so this means that anything that an organization, leaders in organizations want to try to do, in a sense needs to be overriding these natural hardwired tendencies. They need to compensate for what may be the default, which is to be reluctant to speak up. So what do organizations do? Well, here are two common approaches. Organizations use things like suggestion boxes to get input. They use anonymous reporting hotlines and other mechanisms to get people to report ethical issues and wrongdoing. The problem, though, is that these approaches don't necessarily create a culture where employees feel that speaking up is welcome or safe. And in fact, something like an anonymous reporting hotline may implicitly be sending the opposite measure, that it is so unsafe to speak up that we make this anonymous. And so my point isn't that these are not of some value, but alone unlikely to really create a culture where people are comfortable speaking up. And in fact, here's some data looking at the correlation between speaking up and a variety of different practices, and you see a non-significant correlation between formal mechanisms like reporting hotlines and more informal speaking up behavior. So what is it that can be most valuable in creating a culture around speaking up? There's a lot of components, a lot of things we're beginning to appreciate about that, but what seems to be emerging in particular is leadership plays a really critical role, I think consistent with what Linda was talking about, and some particular leadership styles and leadership behaviors in particular that have been shown to relate to voice. And I should note that what the research also suggests is that these are happening at a more micro level. So it's not just leadership at the top, not that that's not important, but that it is leadership at the work group level. In one study that some of my colleagues and I did, we found that within one large organization, there were very different cultures around the safety of speaking up from one unit to another. So what are the leadership styles? Transformational leadership, leaders who show individual consideration and trust, build trust, have been found to elicit more voice behavior from their employees. Leader openness is a very strong predictor of voice. Leaders who demonstrate genuine approachability and receptiveness to input and are seen that way by their employees are more likely to have employees speaking up. And, not surprisingly, again consistent with Linda's comments, ethical leadership. There's at least 2 studies I'm aware of that have found a relationship between the extent to which leaders are exhibiting ethical behaviors and talking about ethical issues and the frequency with which employees are spontaneously speaking up with concerns. Beyond these leader general styles, there's also a few specific leader behaviors, because behavior really is at the foundation of culture. It's the behaviors we observe that help us to create meaning around what the culture is in our workplace. And there's 4 in particular that seem to be especially, although perhaps not exclusively, important for fostering voice. 2 of them are consultation and follow-up. Managers, leaders, supervisors who regularly consult with their employees, solicit their input on different things, are more likely to then get unsolicited input because they're creating a sense of psychological safety and they're conveying that they care about and value input. Managers who follow up, who don't just listen but then take action. Part of the reason that many employees feel, what's the point of speaking up, is their own experiences or they've witnessed others speaking up and nothing happening. So the follow-up's really important. And then 2 others, and these are both from healthcare, some studies that have looked at speaking up within cardiac surgery teams and other healthcare settings, have found that leaders who first of all exhibit humility, meaning acknowledging that they're not perfect and that they're fallible, are much more likely to create a climate, a work group climate, where people are comfortable challenging and speaking up. And hand in hand with that, people in leadership positions who do things to reduce power differences and perceived power differences and create a sense of a flatter structure than a hierarchical structure. So I'm going to stop there, and Sean is going to pick up and talk even more specifically and share some data with you about speaking up around ethical issues in particular.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, so speaking up is still, despite having a huge explosion of popularity, is still a relatively recent field in management. Like, what causes people to speak up is still kind of an open question. We're uncovering a lot more about it. And specific to the ideas for this conference around ethics, we wanted to think about, well, what about ethical voice specifically? Okay, not just speaking up about general problems or ideas, but what about speaking up with ethically problematic practices or issues to your supervisor? The majority of research in employee voice has looked at 2 different types of voice. The first being promotive voice, that's what we call it anyways. It's just speaking up with ideas. Going, hey, I have this idea for something we can change, we can make it better, we can improve this practice some way, here's my idea, boss. Right? The other type is prohibitive voice, and that's more of a negative tone saying there's a problem, we need to stop something, there's a potentially harmful practice that we should get rid of or cut this out, okay, in some way. So one's all about saying here's my idea, the other's all about saying there's a problem we need to stop. But this third part, ethical voice, is something that has not been looked at that specifically, to be totally honest with you. And we're at least treating it for our purposes of this presentation as speaking up about an ethically questionable or problematic issue. And the truth is we don't have a lot of data about that, which puts me in both a daunting but fun position, getting to speak to you about it. Because the answer is, what do we know about it? Not much. Okay, but I tried to find out something to not waste your time. So, the questions that we decided to delve into are, is speaking up about ethical issues substantively different than speaking up with the other two types of voice, about ideas or about problems? Do we feel different about it? Do the things that affect it, is it a different set of factors that affect whether people do it? So how does what we know, the things that Elizabeth talked about, that encourage employee voice, apply to ethical voice specifically? The truth is we just need more data here, so here's some basic descriptive data, okay, that we collected in the past week or so getting ready for this from a bunch of currently employed individuals. So I gathered responses from about 69 folks from an online sample across a whole bunch of different industries, and I asked them to do a forced ranking of 3 types of voice along a number of different dimensions. So they saw statements like, speaking up with an idea, speaking up with a problem, speaking up with an ethically questionable problem or practice. Please rank these in order from most easy to least easy, most scary to least scary, most hurtful to least hurtful to others. And it was on these dimensions: easy, scary, how potentially hurtful to others, how likely to make you or someone else look bad, how confident you would be doing each of these behaviors. Okay, so let's just get these rankings. And what we ended up seeing was incredibly stark. Okay, so first, saying it was the easiest to do by percentages, ethical voice was almost never ranked number 1 in the easiest to do. By far, speaking up with ideas seems to be the most easy. That was by, nearly 60% of the respondents said that one's the easiest by far. And I didn't put up here, but because we have first, second, and third rankings, it basically is an inversion. This was always ranked as the least easy to do also, in case you're curious. But yeah, so it tends to be, and these are statistically significant differences for those of you who are interested in this video. For the next ones, we looked at, okay, scariest to do. Completely different data. Okay? Speaking up with the ethical issues, super scary. Was almost always ranked as the most scary of the 3. Okay? And it was almost never ranked in the 3rd. Hurtful to others? Here, speaking up with ideas, not so hurtful. Who am I hurting just by giving, here's my suggestion, other than myself if it's a bad one. But who am I hurting? Interestingly, in this way, ethical and prohibitive voice seem very similar. If I'm pointing out a problem, it's likely someone else's problem. They're messing up or something like that. And speaking up about ethics might be challenging someone else who has like a morally corrupt sense. Either way, this seems like it could be more hurtful to me. Make me look bad. Here we see the same thing. I'm much more likely to potentially look bad by speaking up with ethical information. And that one I want to come back to as we get a little bit farther down in the data, because I find that one particularly interesting. I think, and just as a really quick teaser in a discussion I hope we have later, I think it's because when we speak up about ethical issues, they're half-baked ideas. They're really hard to add data to, and they're really hard to say, this is morally wrong because. And so people just naturally feel like, boy, I could seem like I'm passing judgment, or I'm putting my own value system out there. People might not agree with it. So it's my sense on this one, but we'll talk about that a little more later. And how confident would you be speaking up with these different types of voice? Ethical voice, again, right down at the bottom. I'm the least confident, which I also would tend to think it's because I don't have a really well-formed argument for an ethical issue like I would for problematic work practices or what have you. So pretty stark comparison here. This aligns really well with some other research that would suggest, and this, I certainly think this data you just looked at would say anecdotally at least, and with a small sample size, all the basic mea culpas, right? Ethical voice seems like it's the least easy one to do. Seems to be the scariest to consider doing. People might feel the least confident in doing it, and like with pointing out problems, people are really worried about hurting other people and looking bad in the process of doing it. All right, so this aligns with really cool research by a very dear friend and my mentor, Jim Dieter, is doing now. He's looking at courage in the workplace and acts of courage. And he went out and he interviewed hundreds of people and came up with this 35 buckets. It's a lot of buckets. I hope he pares it down. But right now, 35 buckets of behaviors that people say require courage to do at work. In those 35 buckets, 6 buckets have to do explicitly with ethical behavior. That is, out of the 35, 6 of them are purely ethical issues that people could require courage to do. Then he had about 700 people rate those 35 vignettes in terms of how much courage do each of these require and how frequently do you see each of these in the workplace. Now, after those 700 rated them, it turned out all 6 of the ethical issues that were in the 35 turned out to be in the top 10 behaviors that will require the most courage to do at work. They also, all 6, appeared in the list of the least frequently done that people see at work. And by the way, when we say the most courage, the high end of this scale was things like throw yourself in front of a bullet, like get stabbed at work and protect you instill. Like, it's like people truly saw this at the same level, basically, as putting yourself into physical danger. Okay? So again, it aligns with some of this really interesting stuff that's coming out now. But now how does what we know, the stuff Elizabeth was presenting, apply to ethical voice? We see that it might be different in some ways, do different things, enable it or suppress it, right? So we took a look at that and got a second collection of people, about 156 people, who instead of doing again, to geek out a little bit, the first one was within subject design, we did the between subject design. We assigned people to one of 3 categories. So this 156 got broken up into 3 groups. Some were assigned to only talk about speaking up with ideas. Another group was assigned to only speaking about problems. The other only about ethical issues, okay? And what they did was they said, how frequently do you have ideas, notice problems, notice ethically questionable behaviors or practices, and then how much do you speak up about those things? Then all of them, no matter what condition they were in, rated whether they speak up with voice. And, and they also filled out a bunch of surveys about their boss. Like, what's your boss like, and what's the context of the workplace you're currently in? And we had them fill out ratings of the same things Elizabeth was showing. Transformational leadership, ethical leadership, how psychologically safe is your environment, to see if we saw different relationships with all those in these types of voice. And here's what we saw. Generally, when asked, do just people generally speak up with ideas? Here's the how much people say they are willing to, or they are the kind of person that would speak up with these different types of voice. Promotive voice, boy, lots of people said, boy, if I have ideas, I would totally share those. Problems, much less. And this was not a statistically significant difference, because it could be smallish samples, but the ethical group even smaller. Okay. Now, how frequently do you even see these things? You'll notice not very often. Do I have ideas on a 1 to 5 scale? Yes, sometimes. That's right about the midpoint. Less. Do I actually see ethical issues or pay attention to them? But now here's the key. I asked people, can you clearly recall a time in your head that you either had an idea, spotted a problem, or had an ethical issue? And people who said no, I removed them from the sample. And then I said, did you report that idea or that problem or that ethical issue to your boss? Now, I want you to notice all of these, it's a yes-no thing, all of them are below 50%. Okay? So even the ideas, not even 50% of them trickled up in this group. But that was the highest, and problems and ethical issues were by far way lower on the likelihood to report to somebody measure. Okay, so, well, how does what we know apply? That's basic stuff. How do the leadership and contextual influences apply to ethical voice? What influences speaking up? How does it relate to what's being raised? And we analyze, like I said, by leadership and contextual influences. No need to parse through this. Let me just walk you through it real quick. These are all correlations of a certain factor. These are the leadership factors. So ethical leadership, transformational, soliciting, active solicitation of voice, being an open boss, or being very humble, to the 3 different types of voice that we're looking at. Now, in a few of these, yeah, the ethical one is a little bit lower, and a few it's higher. I think that's not really important what the raw number is. What I find more interesting is very high and strong correlations across. All right, now that should be very encouraging. Essentially what it's saying is the same things, the same leadership behaviors that encourage other types of voice, probably are really strongly related to the ethical voice too. Okay, and in that way, they seem to have a commonality. Right? So being an ethical leader, being transformational and showing care and concern, building trust, actively soliciting voice, still hugely important for getting the ethical voice too. Right? And on the contextual influences, futility, again, very strong negative effect, as it would, but that's across all 3, it just suppresses all types of voice. The safety in your climate, there was a significant difference between speaking about problems and these other 2, but I don't really know what to chalk that up to. I would still say, look, they're all really strongly significant. So I think what the takeaway we can get from at least the correlational stuff and some of the 2 studies we've looked at, now we've covered some of the tables, is ethical voice is very similar in a lot of ways to other types of voice that we study. As a matter of fact, it's probably the most similar to speaking up about problems and the prohibitive type of voice. They seem to be very strongly related. But that's encouraging because we can apply a lot of the lessons from prior research to attack this problem of speaking up about voice. They will likely apply. Okay? That said, there does also seem to be some differences, all right? And this we just need to understand better. It appears that speaking up with ethical voice is just significantly scarier to do. That people are way more worried about looking bad. It requires a tremendous amount of courage to do it, and people are much, much less confident in doing it, right? So, perhaps in terms of the suggestion of what we could do as researchers and as organizations trying to collaborate together to understand how do we get more of this, we could try to begin addressing not only the access to your bosses, not only the channels for voice, but this deep underlying psychology that people might have that undermines their confidence in doing this, that makes them not only feel safe with presenting an idea or a problem or pointing out an ethically problematic practice, but making them comfortable with sharing what probably is a half-baked idea or a vague notion about that something might be wrong. Right? That's the level of comfort that we might need to try to encourage them to feel. So these leadership behaviors and styles are still hugely important. These are the ones that Elizabeth showed. But we just need much more information about this. We get some senses that it's similar in some ways, but very different in others, and we need to understand that better. And I applaud the intent of this organization, this conference, and Ethics by Design, because I think we can attack this together and get more data around this. So that is mine, and I'll turn it over to Rick now, too. Thank you, sir. Thank
you. Just scroll right into it. Thank you. The research is tremendous, and there's a lot of different ways that I could see applying it in practice, which says a lot. So I think that the organization and what you're trying to do is great for business and for academia, because I think that there's a lot of value and traction that we can get from this. I'm going to take a little bit different approach, obviously, and I'm not a pacer like a professor, so I'm standing to the side. But what I will do is talk to some of the same kinds of themes. You know, I love professors. What I'll do is I'll cover many of the same topics, as you'll see, but it's going to come from a different lens, because my delivery of these subjects has to go to an audience that doesn't always want to or necessarily understand these subjects, for the very reason that it's difficult to spot an ethical issue when you see one, or even to articulate and have the bravery to come forward with it. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you what most organizations think about, which is driven by money. Now, there's a lot of information in the slide. I would have animated if I had time, but if you could just bear with me. The report to nations, and I don't know how familiar everybody is with it, by the Certified Fraud Examiners Association, talks about occupational fraud. I think it's every 2 years they come out with a report. And the last report, was based on 2015 numbers, shows that $6.3 trillion was stolen by employees from their own businesses worldwide. And that's about $150,000 per instance. And the longer a fraud goes undetected, the greater the loss. But the interesting thing is that the way companies learn about problems is from their employees. 39% are from tips from employees, only followed by internal audits, which is 16%, and then management review. So employees, the eyes and ears of the organization, as I always like to say, are really the source that organizations rely on to tell them about problems as they arise. When you add to employee tips, whether you have a hotline, which most organizations worldwide now have, that number goes up to 47% of the source for understanding where fraud is coming from comes from employees themselves. So that's really the top, the top line analysis on that. In terms of employees reporting, or more likely report, it goes up to 51%, and then customers, and this is a blind spot I think for a lot of organizations, customers, vendors, and third parties also have about 40% is coming from them. Now it's a blind spot because there's a new wave of employment model, or I shouldn't even call it employment model, of workforce model, where contingent workers are being brought more and more into the workplace, and organizations aren't always capturing them on the way in and giving them the mechanisms to speak up or to express themselves when they see problems. And just by these statistics, you can see that a large number are coming from third parties. A recent study, and I think it may have been your mentor I got this study from, it was in the Harvard Business Review, showed that when employees speak freely, retention goes up and financial performance goes up as well. And that our HR executives at my organization were very interested in that idea, and we do a tremendous amount of work around cultural transformation. And the study shows that the way you get employees to open up is with continual requests for feedback and a downplaying of the term whistleblower, which unfortunately, I'll get to this in a few moments, both in Europe and in the US, that's a term that's really being used heavily in the regulatory sphere. And companies, because it's being used so heavily by the regulators, are using it as well, and it actually has the opposite effect. So if you tell people to speak up if you see a problem, then you get into the courage realm, and people will close up. If you say, I want feedback, I want innovation, I want ideas to make our process better, oh, and by the way, if you happen to see something that doesn't feel quite right, we want to hear about that too. Much more powerful message and more likely to get a higher instance of reporting. So the value on intelligence is very high. No one really has a closed door policy, so it's ironic that everybody talks about the open door policy. Why even say it? What it really should be is that your ideas count. And I respect your ideas, and I actually just had this discussion yesterday where I came out of a meeting, and at the end the person said to me, he said, we didn't agree on anything. And I said, that's good, that was a good meeting. If you walk into, if you have a meeting, you're sitting around, everybody's just nodding their heads up and down, what are you really accomplishing? The only way to get someplace is by having open discussions and dialogue and disagreements. That's really how you get to a better place. The fear of consequences and the sense of futility are the two barriers that stop employees from speaking up. And the fear of consequences is also, I guess, code for retaliation or anti-retaliation programs. And I know I'd be remiss not to mention that Ronnie is here from ECI, who just released a report, a Blue Ribbon panel report on high-quality programs. And there's an emphasis on how to get to retaliation in that report, and I encourage everybody to read it. But there's a level of due diligence to follow up with employees who have made reports to make sure that there weren't consequences or ripple effects in their careers as a result of speaking up, which I think is important research. However, it's in some respects aspirational. I don't know how many companies are there yet, but it's a place for organizations to look toward. So if employees are observing misconduct, the question is, are they reporting it? And this is research that was recently released from CEB, and it's an interesting graph because it shows that as favorability or trust in an organization's culture goes up, the instances of misconduct being observed goes down, and the extent of employee interest in reporting goes up. So the better employees feel about their organizational culture, the more likely it is that they're going to see fewer problems and speak up when they do see them. So it's kind of like the perfect storm. I would imagine that most organizations are going to fall into that neutral space, and I also would like to get behind some of the research to understand how the culture measurements was being done, and it may be through surveys like the ones that are being discussed here today. The next question is, if employees speak up, and I think this is really start getting at the crux of the issue, at least from my perspective, if they speak up, are managers compared to listen up? And one of the things that I've been speaking about in our organization is changing the mantra from speak up to listen up, because, and I saw I like that cartoon, I may use that. There's so much talk in corporate about, in all organizations, about the importance of speaking up. But are managers really good listeners? And how do you train your managers to be better listeners? This is a study also from CEB which shows that the level of confidence, these are questions that were asked to managers and their level of confidence of knowing what to do if an employee speaks up to them or reports a problem to them. And as you can see, that as the confidence level goes up with management, the more likely it is that there's going to be self-reporting. So there is a direct correlation behind these. This one really goes, what I would say is really a crux of an issue that financial services and healthcare face, which are both highly regulated industries, which shows, and it's an interesting study, which shows when no compliance conditions are viewed favorably, that means employees who take compliance training don't view it as adding value to their job, and they view compliance as a burden in the workplace, and they don't know about an anonymous system to report, what happens is you get very low reporting. But as you add favorable scores on employees who can apply their training to day-to-day work, it goes up. When you add that they don't view compliance as a burden, it kicks up again. And then when you also know that there's an anonymous way to report, it goes up. And the reason I say it's important for highly regulated industries is because we keep asking ourselves over and over again, why these industries continue to get into trouble? Why is there so much ethical breach that takes place that the Inspector General is worried about and the Fed is looking into? And maybe it's because there's so much compliance that's being foisted upon the employees, it raises the level of dissatisfaction or discontent so that when they see something, they don't say something. It's a theory of it. I think this graph really goes toward that. So here's some practical challenges and things that I've talked about for a number of years, not just in my most recent role, but coaching leaders to lead is really important so that when the problem does come to them that they're able to act on it. The challenge is that there's so many varying styles and ways of dealing with people, because really this boils down to, we were just talking before we started, it's a matter of personal interaction. How did it go this week, and how's your day? Tell me about your family. Little things like that are what get people comfortable. But the consistency of the messaging is really the most important thing in terms of just the themes that you want going out in your organization. What I see a lot of companies doing, especially global ones, is there's a lot of web-based training that takes place, and they try to do it even with ethics. And you can't do ethics training because what people do is they put their feet up on their desk and they click through until they get to the end, and they comply. They hit their certificate of compliance and they move on. What I'm considering doing, because I'm going to do web-based training again this year, is, and I learned this from a conference a couple weeks ago, is to put the certification at the beginning of the training, to say that by saying that you're clicking yes, that means you're going to read this carefully, you're going to understand it, and you're going to read the code of ethics at the end, or within a couple of days of doing the training, which I understand from a study with expense reports that it has the effect of creating more, fostering more honesty. But planning ahead, and what I have done in the future, and which is very effective, is cascaded manager-led training using a video with vignettes, where you can coach managers on how to stand up in front of a room and say that it's important to me, that you tell me when you have something on your mind. And again, that's the messaging around, if you have an innovative idea, if you have something that you think would be helpful to the workplace or to the team, and if you're really not sure and you're really uncomfortable, there are other ways you can express yourself besides coming to me. It's a very powerful message that you really can't convey through a web-based training. The other thing that actually we're doing at our organization is this program called Managing at Our Best, or At Our Best. And this goes to the notion of, we talk a lot about the tone at the top, and this really deals with what I would say the echo from the bottom. And at our best is something that went to all employees at the bottom of the organization about how to be your best as an employee. The second part of it was managing at our best, which went to middle management, which helps them develop skills to create a feedback culture, constantly asking for feedback and help. And now we're in the midst of developing leading at our best, which is going to go to the top level of the organization last. And I think that's the right sequence of dealing with it. Because too often organizations try to take it from the top down, and they forget that the eyes and ears of the organization, as I was saying earlier, are really the ones that can protect the organization. And then lastly, I mentioned the regulatory pressures that could affect internal messaging, and this is an ongoing struggle, but I'm looking more and more to curb the loose use of the term whistleblower in an organization, because it runs counter to the research that says that you need to tone it down in terms of the cues, because you could spook people from wanting to report. And safeguarding against retaliation is a double-edged sword. You want to say that you don't want, that you don't tolerate retaliation, but by using that term in your messaging, people get the impression that this must be really dangerous. Otherwise, I shouldn't say a word. So it's a very tricky wicket, but it's something that's important to keep in mind. And then lastly, I'm an attorney, but I've learned over the years that communications, HR, training are all very important elements of what needs to be done. And these groups need to be tightly coordinated in an organization in order to convey the right messages and to be able to execute. So we can take the research and we put it to practice, but only when you're using all three of those elements of the company. And that's it. I'll turn it back over.
Thank you all. So we have about 15 minutes for a discussion before we break for lunch. And I thought I would pick up on a theme from this panel, but also the earlier panel when Linda and Brian were talking about the interplay between formal and informal cultures and this alignment concept. And I think, Rick, as you were talking about the regulatory pressures, particularly relating to items which I think, as a former regulator and lawyer, I think the concept of anti-retaliation laws certainly is a positive. But I find interesting that within organizations, these types of things, including potentially anonymous reporting hotlines, and these big trends that we're seeing in the ethics and compliance industry could actually have negative impact within organizations. So I was hoping you could all talk more about what's an ethics and compliance officer to do? How do you fight against this wave of what's happening within the industry to try to encourage more employee voice, knowing what we know about the behavioral part?
Well, I can give one example that might tease out that issue a little bit more. There's a notion that employees should be told that not only are they asked to speak up internally, but they also have the option to speak out, which is to go outside the organization to report under the Dodd-Frank boundary rules. And if you don't tell employees that, then you run the risk, and I'm not suggesting that this has been done, but there are arguments that it could be done, that you're chilling the speech of employees by not giving them that option, by suggesting the only place that you could speak up is internally.
Right.
And that creates, and I've had these discussions with lawyers and with practitioners. It's a very tricky subject because you want to give them the option, but if you're silent, then you don't want to be viewed as chilling the speech of employees.
And for clarification, I think what you're referring to is the most recent Dodd-Frank regulations. The SEC allows for whistleblower bounties for original information relating to fraud or other tips that help the SEC bring forth an enforcement action. And there's a requirement that you tell your employees that this option exists. So there's the financial incentives to report out versus the other incentives that ethics officers try to promote for internal reporting, which creates this dichotomy.
If I may, there also might be, it's important to not lose the nuance here too. I mean, I think what the data that Elizabeth was showing about the different types of mechanisms and how they encourage voice, the formal mechanisms like anonymous hotlines and suggestion boxes were the least strongly correlated, but that correlation wasn't negative.
Right.
So I think that's important to point out. I think it's also important to note that, which essentially would just mean, yeah, they're not harming necessarily, and they're critical to have because when we study employee voice and speaking up, we're not typically studying, because it's just too rare of an event, multi-billion-dollar fraud, right? So what we're studying is like speaking up about everyday problems and issues that people are facing, being treated badly by your boss, people are like messing up their expense accounts and so on and so forth. And for those types of things, the formal mechanisms like an anonymous suggestion box or hotline tend to be significantly less effective than having a boss that treats you really well and that shows you that consideration, interpersonal care. Having people around you, like the It Takes a Village stuff that you guys have worked on, that also support you in speaking up. So it's the social climate to a huge degree. But you have to have those formal mechanisms to allow people to speak up about what could be that gigantic multi-billion-dollar fraud. Those things are hugely important. So I think it's important to not lose the nuance. That's all I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it also speaks, this concept of nuance, to the idea of finding ethical voice. And one thing I wonder, for those of you who are in organizations, whether there are challenges relating to the gray area. What is an ethical dilemma? It's not always easy to tell in the world of business, I think. So how do you, knowing what we know again about how difficult it is to put yourself out there about something you're not really sure about, you have this gut feeling that it's not right. How do we help encourage employees to find their ethical voice relating to all of this? I think it's a pretty big challenge, and if there's ideas or best practices people have seen, I think it'd be important to talk about.
I find that asking employees to be able to spot an ethical issue is almost impossibility on an organizational level, because most high-level individuals, and even the fact that we have so many great minds in a room like this discussing this topic, suggests that it's not something easy to get your hands around. So I'd much rather see an organization open up the channels of communication so that you're willing to listen to any problem. No question is too bad, is too small. You don't have the 20-year storm case. You don't sit around waiting for your 20-year storm case. You do listen to all the smaller issues and look for patterns of activity or the temperature of the organization, if you will, and you attack from that perspective. And as they cross through your system or your managers learn about it, then you can say, that looks like an ethical issue, and then you can deal with it, rather than ask them to tell us about ethical problems.
I think that's a really important point, because context matters so much, and everything that we're talking about related to speaking up about ethical issues, it's within the larger context of what type of workplace environment you have. About just the safety of disagreeing with the boss, and just speaking up about problems. And if that context is there, that's an environment in which, when that rare event, what you hope is a rare event of a really significant ethical issue comes up, that you're going to be more likely to have this be, perhaps not kind of an ordinary everyday thing, but a less, less frightening thing to deal with, because there's just those norms in place.
Actually, just to comment, one thing I'm helping my client do, and I know a lot of companies are not willing to do this, but we're taking all of the hotline reports and the results from that, sanitizing a lot of those, highlighting some of the ones that have been reported over and over again, like data breach or certain things, and writing them in the blog. We take all the names out, and we're helping them publish it on an intranet blog site. Because one of the reasons why people don't report is the futility of it. So we want to show to employees that, hey, something happens, and this is how the company dealt with it, whether someone got disciplined or whatever. So we wanted to show employees that something happens to these reports.
That's actually, that is a best practice, and in fact, in the UK and their new regulations that are coming out, they're actually requiring feedback, which all of us scratch our head and say, all right, well, how do you give feedback to a whistleblower? Because they're giving a report about somebody else's problem. So it's really not their business, if you will. Thank you for informing us, for providing the tip, but just we have to make sure there's fairness in the process, and they know that it was done and followed through. It is a good practice. Something we're looking into is sanitizing some case studies, if you will, and showing that there's consequence, and so not only a negative consequence, but sometimes good things that come out of those reports, and then publish them so people know that there's actually a means to an end.